Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's take a relaxing journey into the past with more from the Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and a Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Camille Charles Maspero, DCL Oxford, member of the Institute of France, professor at the Collège de France, ex-Director General of Egyptian Museums, translated by Amelia B. Edwards in a new edition revised and enlarged by the author, with 309 illustrations, first published in 1895. Let's pick up right where we left off at the beginning of Chapter 3. Let's begin. Chapter 3. Tombs. The Egyptians regarded man as composed of various different entities, each having its separate life and functions. First there was the body, then the ka or double, which was a less solid duplicate of the corporeal form, a colored but ethereal projection of the individual, reproducing him feature for feature. The double of a child was a child, the double of a woman was as a woman, the double of a man was as a man. After the double, ka, came the soul, bi or ba, which was popularly represented as a human-headed bird. After the soul came the ku, or the luminous, a spark from the divine fire. None of these elements were in their own natures imperishable. Left to themselves, they would hasten to dissolution, and the man would thus die a second time. That is to say, he would be annihilated. The piety of the survivors found means, however, to avert this catastrophe. By the process of embalmment, they could for ages suspend the decomposition of the body, while by means of prayer and offerings they saved the double, the soul, and the luminous from the second death. The double never left the place where the mummy reposed, but the soul and the ku went forth to follow the gods. They, however, kept perpetually returning, like travelers who come home after an absence. The tomb was therefore a dwelling house, the eternal house of the dead, compared with which the houses of the living were but wayside inns. And these eternal houses were built after a plan which exactly corresponded to the Egyptian idea of the afterlife. The eternal house must always include the private rooms of the soul, which were closed on the day of burial, and which no living being could enter without being guilty of sacrilege. It must also contain the reception rooms of the double, where priests and friends brought their wishes or their offerings, the two being connected by a passage of more or less length. The arrangement of these three parts varied according to the period, the place, the nature of the ground, and the caprice of each person. The rooms accessible to the living were frequently built above ground and formed a separate edifice. Sometimes they were excavated in the mountainside as well as the tomb itself. Sometimes again the vault where the mummy lay hidden and the passages leading to that vault were in one place, while the place of prayer and offering stood far off in the plain. But whatever variety there may be found as to detail and arrangement, the principle is always the same. The tomb is a dwelling, and it is constructed in such wise as may best promote the well-being and ensure the preservation of the dead. 1. Mastabas. The most ancient monumental tombs are found in the necropolis of Memphis, between Abu Roash and Dashur, and in that of Medum. They belong to the mastaba type. The mastaba, shown in figure 113, is a quadrangular building, which from a distance might be taken for a truncated pyramid. Many mastabas are from 30 to 40 feet in height, 150 feet in length, and 80 feet in width, while others do not exceed 10 feet in height or 15 feet in length. The faces are symmetrically inclined and generally smooth, though sometimes the courses retreat like steps. The materials employed are stone or brick. The stone is limestone, cut in blocks about 2.5 feet long, 2 feet high, and 20 inches thick. 3 sorts of limestone were employed. For the best tombs, the fine white limestone of Tura, or the compact siliceous limestone of Saqqara. For ordinary tombs, the marly limestone of the Libyan hills. This last, impregnated with salt and veined with crystalline gypsum, is a friable material and unsuited for ornamentation. The bricks are of 2 kinds, both being merely sun-dried. The most ancient kind, which ceased to be used about the time of the 6th dynasty, is small, 8.7 by 4.3 by 5.5 inches, yellowish, and made of nothing but sand, mixed with a little clay and grit. The later kind is of mud mixed with straw, black, compact, carefully molded, and of a fair size, 15 by 7.1 by 5.5 inches. The style of the internal construction differs according to the material employed by the architect. In 9 cases out of 10, the stone mastabas are but outwardly regular in construction. The core is of roughly quarried rubble, mixed with rubbish and limestone fragments hastily bedded in layers of mud, or piled up without any kind of mortar. The brick mastabas are nearly always of homogeneous construction. The facing bricks are carefully mortared, and the joints inside are filled up with sand. That the mastaba should be canonically oriented, the 4 faces set to the 4 cardinal points, and the longer axis laid from north to south, was indispensable. But practically, the masons took no special care about finding the true north, and the orientation of these structures is seldom exact. At Giza, the mastabas are distributed according to a symmetrical plan and ranged in regular streets. At Saqqara, at Abu Sir, and at Dashur, they are scattered irregularly over the surface of the plateau, crowded in some places and wide apart in others. The Mussulman cemetery at Siut perpetuates the like arrangement, and enables us to this day to realize the aspect of the Memphite necropolis towards the close of the ancient empire. A flat, unpaved platform, formed by the top course of the core, covers the top of the mass of the mastaba. This platform is scattered over with terracotta vases, nearly buried in the loose rubbish. These lie thickly over the hollow interior, but are more sparsely deposited elsewhere. The walls are bare. The doors face to the eastward side. They occasionally face towards the north or south side, but never towards the west. In theory, there should be two doors, one for the dead, the other for the living. In practice, the entrance for the dead was a mere niche, high and narrow, cut in the eastward face near the northeast corner. At the back of this niche are marked vertical lines framing in a closed space. Even this imitation of a door was sometimes omitted, and the soul was left to manage as best it might. The door of the living was made more or less important, according to the greater or less development of the chamber to which it led. The chamber and door are in some cases represented by only a shallow recess, decorated with a stela and a table of offerings, as shown in figure 114. This is sometimes protected by a wall which projects from the facade, thus forming a kind of forecourt open to the north. The forecourt is square in the tomb of Kapir in figure 114 and irregular in that of Neferhotep at Saqqara, figure 116. When the plan includes one or more chambers, the door sometimes opens in the middle of a small architectural facade, or under a little portico supported by two square pillars, without either base or abacus. The doorway is very simple, the two jambs being ornamented with bas-relief representing the deceased, and surmounted by a cylindrical drum engraved with his name and titles. In the tomb of Pohunika at Saqqara, the jambs are two pilasters, each crowned with two lotus flowers, but this example is, so far, unique. The chapel was usually small and lost in the mass of the building, as shown in figure 119, but no precise rule determined its size. In the tomb of T, there is first a portico, A, then a square antechamber with pillars, B, then a passage, C, with a small room, D, on the right, leading to the last chamber, E, as shown in figure 120. There was room enough in this tomb for many persons, and in point of fact, the wife of T reposed by the side of her husband. When the monument belonged to only one person, the structure was less complicated. A short and narrow passage led to an oblong chamber, upon which it opened at right angles, so that the place is in shape of a letter T, figure 121. The end wall is generally smooth, but sometimes it is recessed just opposite the entrance passage, and then the plan forms a cross, of which the head is longer or shorter. This was the ordinary arrangement, but the architect was free to reject it if he so pleased. Here in figure 123, a chapel consists of two parallel lobbies connected by a cross passage. Elsewhere, the chamber opens from a corner of the passage, as shown in figure 124. Again, in the tomb of Ptahhotep, the site was hemmed in by older buildings and was not large enough. The builders therefore joined the new mastaba to the older one in such wise as to give them one entrance in common, and thus the chapel of the one is enlarged by absorbing the whole of the space occupied by the other. The chapel was the reception room of the double. It was there that the relations, friends, and priests celebrated the funerary sacrifices on the days prescribed by law. That is to say, at the feasts of the commencement of the seasons, at the feast of Thoth on the first day of the year, at the feast of Uaga, at the great feast of Sothis, on the day of the procession of the god Min, at the feast of showbread, at the feasts of the month and the half-months, and the days of the week. Offerings were placed in the principal room at the foot of the west wall, at the exact spot leading to the entrance of the eternal home of the dead. Unlike the Qibla of the mosques or Mussulman oratories, this point is not always oriented towards the same quarter of the compass, though often found to the west. In the earliest times it was indicated by a real door, low and narrow, framed and decorated like the door of an ordinary house, but not pierced through. An inscription graven upon the lintel in large readable characters commemorated the name and rank of the owner. His portrait, either sitting or standing, was carved upon the jambs, and a scene, sculptured or painted on the space above the door, represented him seated before a small round table, stretching out his hand towards the repast placed upon it. A flat slab or offering table, built into the floor between the two uprights of the doorway, received the votive meats and drinks. The general appearance of the recess is that of a somewhat narrow doorway. As a rule it was empty, but occasionally it contained a portrait statue of the dead, standing with one foot forward, as though about to cross the gloomy threshold of his tomb, descend the few steps before him, advance into his reception room or chapel, and pass out into the sunlight, as shown in Figure 126. As a matter of fact, the stela symbolized the door leading to the private apartments of the dead, a door closed and sealed to the living. It was inscribed on doorposts and lintels, and its inscription was no mere epitaph for the information of future generations. All the details which it gave as to the name, rank, functions, and family of the deceased were intended to secure the continuity of his individuality and civil status in the life beyond death. A further and essential object of its inscriptions was to provide him with food and drink by means of prayers or magic formulae, constraining one of the gods of the dead, Osiris or Anubis, to act as intermediary between him and his survivors, and to set apart for his use some portion of the provisions offered for his sake in sacrifice to one or other of these deities. By this agency, the kas or doubles of these provisions were supposed to be sent on into the next world to gladden and satisfy the human ka indicated to the divine intermediary. Offerings of real provisions were not indispensable to this end. Any chance visitor in times to come who should simply repeat the formula of the stela aloud would thereby secure the immediate enjoyment of all the good things enumerated to the unknown dead whom he evoked. The living having taken their departure, the double was supposed to come out of his house and feed. In principle, this ceremony was bound to be renewed year by year till the end of time. But the Egyptians ere long discovered that this could not be. After 2 or 3 generations, the dead of former days were neglected for the benefit of those more recently departed. Even when a pious foundation was established, with a revenue payable for the expenses of the funerary repasts and of the priests whose duty it was to prepare them, the evil hour of oblivion was put off for only a little longer. Sooner or later, there came a time when the double was reduced to seek his food among the town refuse, and amid the ignoble and corrupt filth which lay rejected on the ground. Then, in order that the offerings consecrated on the day of burial might forever preserve their virtues, the survivors conceived the idea of drawing and describing them on the walls of the chapel. The painted or sculptured reproductions of persons and things ensured the reality of those persons and things for the benefit of the one on whose account they were executed. Thus the double saw himself depicted upon the walls in the act of eating and drinking, and he ate and drank. This notion once accepted, the theologians and artists carried it out to the fullest extent. Not content with offering mere pictured provisions, they added thereto the semblance of the domains which produced them, together with the counterfeit presentment of the herds, workmen, and slaves belonging to the same. Was a supply of meat required to last for eternity? It was enough, no doubt, to represent the several parts of an ox or a gazelle, the shoulder, the leg, the ribs, the breast, the heart, the liver, the head, properly prepared for the spit. But it was equally easy to retrace the whole history of the animal, its birth, its life in the pasture lands, its slaughter, the cutting up of the carcass, and the presentation of the joints. So also as regarded the cakes and bread offerings, there was no reason why the whole process of tillage, harvesting, corn threshing, storage, and dough kneading should not be rehearsed. Clothing, ornaments, and furniture served in like manner as a pretext for the introduction of spinners, weavers, goldsmiths, and cabinet makers. The master is of superhuman proportions and towers above his people and his cattle. Some prophetic tableaux show him in his funeral bark, speeding before the wind with all sails set, having started on his way to the next world the very day that he takes possession of his new abode, as shown in figure 128. Elsewhere we see him as actively superintending his imaginary vassals, as formerly he superintended his vassals of flesh and blood, figure 129. Varied and irregular as they may appear, these scenes are not placed at random upon the walls. They all converge towards that semblance of a door which was supposed to communicate with the interior of the tomb. Those nearest to the door represent the sacrifice and the offering, the earlier stages of preparation and preliminary work being depicted in retrograde order as that door is left farther and farther behind. At the door itself, the figure of the master seems to await his visitors and bid them welcome. The details are of infinite variety. The inscriptions run to a less or greater length according to the caprice of the scribe. The false door loses its architectural character and is frequently replaced by a mere stela engraved with the name and rank of the master. Yet whether large or small, whether richly decorated or not decorated at all, the chapel is always the dining room, or rather the larder, to which the dead man has access when he feels hungry. On the other side of the wall was constructed a hiding place, in the form of either a high and narrow cell or a passage without outlet. To this hiding place archaeologists have given the Arab name of serdab. Most mastabas contain but one, others contain 3 or 4. These serdabs communicated neither with each other nor with the chapel, and are, as it were, buried in the masonry. Figure 131. If connected at all with the outer world, it is by means of an aperture in the wall, about as high up as a man's head, and so small that the hand can with difficulty pass through it. To this orifice came the priests, with murmured prayers and perfumes of incense. Within lurked the double, ready to profit by these memorial rites, or to accept them through the medium of his statues, as when he lived upon earth, the man needed a body in which to exist. His corpse, disfigured by the process of embalmment, bore but a distant resemblance to its former self. The mummy again was destructible, and might easily be burned, dismembered, scattered to the winds. Once it had disappeared, what was to become of the double? The portrait statues walled up inside the serdab became, when consecrated, the stone or wooden bodies of the defunct. The pious care of his relatives multiplied these bodies, and consequently multiplied the supports of the double. A single body represented a single chance of existence for the double. 20 bodies represented 20 such chances. For the same reason, statues also of his wife, his children, and his servants were placed with the statues of the deceased, the servants being modeled in the act of performing their domestic duties, such as grinding corn, kneading dough, and applying a coat of pitch to the inside surfaces of wine jars. As for the figures which were merely painted on the walls of the chapel, they detached themselves and assumed material bodies inside the serdab. Notwithstanding these precautions, all possible means were taken to guard the remains of the fleshly body from natural decay and the depredations of the spoiler. In the tomb of T, an inclined passage, starting from the middle of the first hall, leads from the upper world to the sepulchral vault, but this is almost a solitary exception. Generally, the vault is reached by way of a vertical shaft constructed in the center of the platform, figure 133, or more rarely in a corner of the chapel. The depth of this shaft varies from 10 to 100 feet. It is carried down through the masonry. It pierces the rock, and at the bottom a low passage in which it is not possible to walk upright leads in a southward direction to the vault. There sleeps the mummy in a massive sarcophagus of limestone, red granite, or basalt. Sometimes, though rarely, the sarcophagus bears the name and titles of the deceased. Still more rarely, it is decorated with ornamental sculpture. Some examples are known which reproduce the architectural decoration of an Egyptian house, with its doors and windows. The furniture of the vault is of the simplest character. Some alabaster perfume vases, a few cups into which the priest had poured drops of the various libation liquids offered to the dead, some large red pottery jars for water, a headrest of wood or alabaster, a scribe's votive pallet. Having laid the mummy in the sarcophagus and cemented the lid, the workmen strewed the floor of the vault with the quarters of oxen and gazelles which had just been sacrificed. They next carefully walled up the entrance into the passage, and filled the shaft to the top with a mixture of sand, earth, and stone chips. Being profusely watered, this mass solidified and became an almost impenetrable body of concrete. The corpse, left to itself, received no visits now save from the soul, which from time to time quitted the celestial regions wherein it voyaged with the gods and came down to reunite itself with the body. The sepulchral vault was the abode of the soul, as the funerary chapel was the abode of the double. Up to the time of the 6th dynasty, the walls of the vault were left bare. Only once did Mariette find a vault containing half-effaced inscriptions from the Book of the Dead. In 1881, however, I discovered some tombs at Saqqara in which the vault is decorated in preference to the chapel. These tombs are built with large bricks, a niche and a stela sufficing for the reception of sacrificial offerings. In place of the shaft, they contain a small rectangular court, in the western corner of which was placed the sarcophagus. Over the sarcophagus was erected a limestone chamber, just as long and as wide as the sarcophagus itself, and about 3.5 feet high. This was roofed in with flat slabs. At the end, or in the wall to the right, was a niche, which answered the purpose of a serdab, and above the flat roof was then constructed an arch of about 1.5 feet radius, the space above the arch being filled in with horizontal courses of brickwork up to the level of the platform. The chamber occupies about 2/3 of the cavity and looks like an oven with the mouth open. Sometimes the stone walls rest on the lid of the sarcophagus, the chamber having evidently been built after the interment had taken place, as shown in Figure 134. Generally speaking, however, these walls rest on brick supports, so that the sarcophagus may be opened or closed when required. The decoration, which is sometimes painted, sometimes sculptured, is always the same. Each wall was a house stocked with the objects depicted or catalogued upon its surface, and each was therefore carefully provided with a fictitious door, through which the double had access to his goods. On the left wall he found a pile of provisions, Figure 135, and a table of offerings. On the end wall a store of household utensils, as well as a supply of linen and perfumes, the name and quantity of each being duly registered. These paintings more briefly sum up the scenes depicted in the chapels of ordinary mastabas. Transferred from their original position to the walls of an underground cellar, they were the more surely guaranteed against such possible destruction as might befall them in chambers open to all comers, while upon their preservation depended the length of time during which the dead man would retain possession of the property which they represented. 2. The Pyramids. Editor's note: for the following translation of this section of Professor Maspero's book, I am indebted to the kindness of Mr. W. M. Flinders Petrie, whose work on the pyramids and temples of Giza, published with the assistance of a grant from the Royal Society in 1883, constitutes our standard authority on the construction of these pyramids. A.B.E. The royal tombs have the form of pyramids, with a square base, and are the equivalent in stone or brick of the tumulus of heaped earth which was piled over the body of the warrior chief in prehistoric times. The same ideas prevailed as to the souls of kings as about those of private men. The plan of the pyramid consists therefore of three parts, like the mastaba: the chapel, the passage, and the sepulchral vault. The chapel is always separate. At Saqqara, no trace of it has been found. It was probably, as later on at Thebes, in a quarter nearer to the town. At Madum, Giza, Abusir, and Dashur, these temples stood at the east or north fronts of the pyramids. They were true temples with chambers, courts, and passages. The fragments of bas-relief hitherto found show scenes of sacrifice and prove that the decoration was the same as in the public halls of the mastabas. The pyramid, properly speaking, contained only the passages and sepulchral vault, the oldest of which the texts show the existence north of Abydos is that of Sneferu. The latest belongs to the princes of the 12th dynasty. The construction of these monuments was therefore a continuous work, lasting for 13 or 14 centuries under government direction. Granite, alabaster, and basalt, for the sarcophagus and some details, were the only materials of which the use and the quantity was not regulated in advance, and which had to be brought from a distance. To obtain them, each king sent one of the great men of his court on a mission to the quarries of Upper Egypt, and the quickness with which the blocks were brought back was a strong claim upon the sovereign's favor. The other material was not so costly. If mainly brick, the bricks were molded on the spot, with earth taken from the foot of the hill. If of stone, the nearest parts of the plateau provided the common marly limestone in abundance. The fine limestone of Tura was usually reserved for the chambers and the casing, and this might be had without even sending specially for it to the opposite side of the Nile, for at Memphis there were stores always full, upon which they continually drew for public buildings, and therefore also for the royal tombs. The blocks being taken from these stores and borne by boats to close below the hill were raised to their required places along gently sloping causeways. The internal arrangement of the pyramids, the lengths of the passages, and their heights were very variable. The pyramid of Khufu, Cheops, rose to 475 feet above the ground. The smallest was not 30 feet high. The difficulty of imagining now what motives determined the pharaohs to choose such different proportions has led some to think that the mass built was in direct proportion to the time occupied in building, that is to say, to the length of each reign. Thus it was supposed that the king would begin by hastily erecting a pyramid large enough to contain the essential parts of a tomb, and then, year by year, would add fresh layers around the first core, until the time when his death forever arrested the growth of the monument. But the facts do not justify this hypothesis. The smallest of the pyramids of Saqqara is that of Unas, who reigned 30 years, while the two imposing pyramids of Giza were raised by Khufu and Khafra, or Khephren, who governed Egypt, the one for 24 and the other for 23 years. Merenra, who died very young, had a pyramid as large as that of Pepi II, whose reign lasted more than 90 years. The plan of each pyramid was laid down once for all by the architect, according to the instructions which he had received and the resources placed at his disposal. He then followed it out to the end of the work without increasing or reducing the scale. The pyramids were supposed to have their four faces to the four cardinal points, like the mastabas, but either from bad management or neglect, the greater part are not oriented exactly, and many very distinctly from the true north. Without speaking of the ruins of Abu Roash or Zoyat al-Aryan, which have not been closely studied enough, they naturally form 6 groups, distributed from north to south on the border of the Libyan plateau, from Giza to the Fayoum, by Abusir, Saqqara, Dashur, and Lisht. The Giza group contains 9, including those of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaura, which were anciently reckoned among the wonders of the world. The ground on which the pyramid of Khufu stands was very irregular at the time of construction. A small rocky height which rose above the surface was roughly cut, figure 136, and enclosed in the masonry, the rest being smoothed and covered with large slabs, some of which still remain. The pyramid itself was 481 feet high and 755 feet wide, dimensions which the injuries of time have reduced to 454 feet and 750 feet respectively. It preserved until the Arab conquest a casing of stones of different colors, so skillfully joined as to appear like one block from base to summit. The casing work was begun from the top and the cap placed on first, the steps being covered one after the other until they reached the bottom. In the inside, all was arranged so as to hide the exact place of the sarcophagus and to baffle any spoilers whom chance or perseverance had led aright. The first point was to discover the entrance under the casing which masked it. It was nearly in the middle of the north face, but at the level of the 18th course, at about 45 feet from the ground. When the block which closed it was displaced, an inclined passage 41.2 inches wide and 47.6 inches high was revealed, the lower part of which was cut in the rock. This descended for 317 feet, passed through an unfinished chamber, and ended 60 feet farther in a blind passage. This would be a first disappointment to the spoilers. If, however, they were not discouraged, but examined the passage with care, they would find in the roof, 62 feet distant from the door, a block of granite among the surrounding limestone. It was so hard that the seekers, after having vainly tried to break or remove it, took the course of forcing a way through the softer stone around. This obstacle passed, they came into an ascending passage, which joins the first at an angle of 120 degrees, and is divided into 2 branches. One branch runs horizontally into the center of the pyramid, and ends in a limestone chamber with pointed roof, which is called, without any good reason, the Queen's Chamber. The other, continuing upward, changes its form and appearance. It becomes a gallery 148 feet long and 28 feet high, built of macadam stone, so polished and finely wrought that it is difficult to put a needle or even a hair into the joints. The lower courses are vertical, the 7 others corbel forwards, until at the roof they are only 21 inches apart. A fresh obstacle arose at the end of this gallery. The passage which led to the chamber of the sarcophagus was closed by a slab of granite. Farther on was a small vestibule divided in equal spaces by 4 portcullises of granite, which would need to be broken. The royal sepulchre is a granite chamber with a flat roof, 19 feet high, 34 feet long, and 17 feet wide. Here are neither figures nor inscriptions, nothing but a granite sarcophagus, lidless and mutilated. Such were the precautions taken against invaders, and the result showed that they were effectual, for the pyramid guarded its deposit during more than 4,000 years. But the very weight of the materials was a more serious danger. To prevent the sepulchral chamber from being crushed by the 300 feet of stone which stood over it, 5 low hollow spaces, one over the other, were left above it. The last is sheltered by a pointed roof formed of 2 enormous slabs, leaning one against the other. Thanks to this device, the central pressure was thrown almost entirely on the side faces, and the chamber was preserved. None of the stones which cover it have been crushed. None have yielded a fraction since the day when the workmen cemented them into their places. The pyramids of Khafra and Menkaura were built on a different plan inside to that of Khufu. Khafra's had 2 entrances, both to the north, one from the platform before the pyramid, the other 50 feet above the ground. Menkaura still preserves the remains of its casing of red granite. The entrance passage descends at an angle of 26 degrees and soon runs into the rock. The first chamber is decorated with panels sculptured in the stone, and was closed at the further end by 3 portcullises of granite. The second chamber appears to be unfinished, but this was a trap to deceive the spoilers. A passage cut in the floor and carefully hidden gave access to a lower chamber. There lay the mummy in a sarcophagus of sculptured basalt. The sarcophagus was still perfect at the beginning of this century. Removed thence by Colonel Howard Vyse, it foundered on the Spanish coast with the ship which was bearing it to England. And on that rather tragic note, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt, a subject that I've found fascinating ever since I was a very small child, and I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the many, many figures and drawings, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.